Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
My mom had told us more than once that she did not like being alone in the bathroom. It was not something she talked about constantly, and she never turned it into a dramatic ghost story. Usually, she would mention it in passing, almost like she was trying to make sense of something she did not fully understand herself. She would say that sometimes, when she was showering, she felt like someone else was in there with her. Not outside the door. Not somewhere else in the house. Inside the bathroom. Right beside her. At first, I did not take it very seriously. I was used to adults saying strange things sometimes, especially about old houses, creaking pipes, or odd feelings late at night. I assumed she was joking. Or maybe she was just talking about that normal, uneasy feeling people get when they are alone in a quiet room. But she did not sound like she was joking. She said she could feel a presence. She would be showering with the curtain closed, water running, unable to hear much beyond the sound of the pipes and the spray hitting the tub. Then, without warning, she would get the feeling that someone was standing close to her. Not just the usual fear of being alone behind a shower curtain. She described it as something more specific than that. She said it felt like someone was watching her. Sometimes she would turn around quickly, expecting to see a person on the other side of the curtain. There would never be anyone there. The bathroom would be empty. The door would be closed. The mirror would show only the ordinary room behind her. But the feeling would stay. She would get out of the shower faster than she planned to. She would dry off quickly, get dressed, and leave the bathroom with the strange certainty that she had not been alone in it. There was one experience she told us about that scared me more than the others. She said that at one point, while she was in the bathroom, she felt hands around her neck. Not a pressure from a towel, not a sudden muscle spasm, not the feeling of a necklace or clothing touching her skin. Hands. She said it felt as though someone had placed both hands around her throat and started to squeeze. She could not see anyone. She did not see a face in the mirror. She did not see a shadow move behind her. But she felt it clearly enough that she panicked. She grabbed at her own neck, trying to pull away from something that was not there. She said the pressure only lasted a few seconds, but it was long enough to leave her shaken. Then it stopped. Just like that. She was alone in the bathroom again. No one else in the family had seen anything unusual at that point. We had all heard her talk about the feeling of someone being there, but nobody had proof of anything. It was easy to blame it on stress, exhaustion, imagination, or the way a bathroom can feel strange when the shower is running and you cannot hear what is happening in the rest of the house. Still, after she told us about the hands around her neck, the bathroom never felt completely normal to me again. It was an ordinary bathroom. There was nothing obviously creepy about it. It had a mirror over the sink, a shower, a toilet, cabinets, towels, and the usual clutter that builds up in a family home. During the day, sunlight could come in through the window. The room looked normal. It felt normal. But once you hear that someone you love has felt invisible hands around their throat in a room, it is hard to walk into that room without remembering it. You begin noticing things you never noticed before. The way the mirror reflects the doorway. The way the shower curtain hangs too still. The way the room seems darker when the hallway light is off. The way you can never see every corner at once. I tried not to think about it too much. I told myself that my mom had probably been scared because she was alone. Maybe she had felt a rush of panic and interpreted it as someone grabbing her. Maybe she was dealing with stress. Maybe the memory had become more frightening every time she told it. That was what I wanted to believe. Then one morning, I saw her in the bathroom. At least, I thought I did. It was a normal morning at first. I had woken up in my bedroom and started getting ready to go downstairs. I do not remember if it was a weekend, a school day, or a morning when everyone was moving slowly around the house. I only remember that the house was already awake. I could hear faint sounds coming from downstairs. There was movement in the kitchen. Maybe cabinets opening. Maybe dishes being set out. Maybe something cooking. The smell of breakfast was beginning to drift up through the house, though at the time I was not really paying attention to it. I stepped out of my bedroom and walked toward the bathroom. The bathroom was upstairs, and I expected it to be empty. I may have needed to brush my teeth, wash my face, use the toilet, or simply get ready for the day. It was the kind of ordinary routine that happens without much thought. As I approached the doorway, I saw my mom standing at the mirror. She was facing the sink. Her back was toward me. She looked completely normal. There was nothing strange about her appearance at first. She had the same shape, the same posture, the same hair, and the same clothes I would expect my mom to be wearing around the house in the morning. She was standing close to the sink, looking into the mirror, almost as if she was getting ready. I did not think anything of it. I said something to her. I do not remember exactly what I said. It may have been a simple good morning. I may have asked her if breakfast was ready. I may have complained about being tired. It could have been anything small and normal. She did not answer. At first, I assumed she did not hear me. Maybe the water was running softly. Maybe she was focused on something in the mirror. Maybe she was just tired and had not fully woken up yet. So I said something again. Still no answer. That should have bothered me more than it did at the time. But when you see someone familiar in a familiar place, your mind automatically makes excuses for them. I thought maybe she was annoyed, distracted, or simply not in the mood to talk. I had seen my mom stand silently in front of a mirror before while brushing her hair, fixing her clothes, or thinking about something. I stood there for another moment. She did not move. She did not turn around. She did not look at me through the mirror. She was just standing there. The bathroom was quiet. I remember feeling a small flicker of discomfort, but I ignored it. Maybe I did not want to bother her. Maybe I assumed she wanted privacy. Maybe I had already gotten used to the idea that she sometimes felt weird in the bathroom, so part of me did not want to stand there too long. I left. I turned away from the bathroom and went downstairs. The stairs were between the upper floor and the kitchen. There was no alternate route that would allow someone to go from upstairs to downstairs without passing through the stairway. If my mom had been standing in the bathroom and then gone to the kitchen, she would have had to walk past me or at least make enough noise for me to notice. But when I reached the kitchen, my mom was there. She was busy preparing breakfast. She was moving around the stove and counter, completely focused on what she was doing. There were dishes out. Food was being prepared. The kitchen smelled warm and normal. For a moment, I just stood there. I remember staring at her. It took my brain a few seconds to catch up. I had just seen her upstairs. I had just spoken to her in the bathroom. She had been standing in front of the mirror. But now, she was in the kitchen. She looked up at me and noticed I was staring. Maybe she asked what was wrong. Maybe she just gave me a confused look. I do not remember her exact expression, only that she seemed completely normal. I asked her if she had just been upstairs. The question came out more casually than I felt. I did not immediately say that I had seen her in the bathroom. I was trying to make sense of it, without sounding strange. She looked at me funny. She said no. I asked again. I said, "Were you just in the bathroom?" She told me she had been in the kitchen the whole morning. She said she had been preparing breakfast. The way she said it made it clear that she had not just come downstairs. She had been there for a while. She had things cooking. She had been moving around the kitchen long enough that it would have been impossible for her to have gone upstairs, stood silently in front of the mirror, then returned without me seeing her. I felt cold. Not physically cold at first, but the kind of cold feeling that starts in your stomach and spreads through your body when you realize something does not make sense. I thought about the stairs. I thought about how narrow the house was. I thought about how I had walked directly from my room toward the bathroom and then downstairs. There was no way she could have gone ahead of me. There was no way she could have passed me without me noticing. I had seen her clearly. I had spoken to her. I had watched her stand there at the mirror. But my mom was standing in the kitchen telling me she had not left it all morning. For a second, I wanted to tell her exactly what I had seen. I wanted to say, "Then, who was upstairs?" But I could not make myself say it. I remembered what she had told us before. I remembered the bathroom. I remembered her saying she felt someone watching her while she showered. I remembered the invisible hands around her throat. And suddenly, I did not want her to know that I had seen something in there too. I was afraid she would panic. I was afraid she would think I was trying to scare her. I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it more real. So I said nothing. I acted like I had simply been confused. Maybe I shrugged it off. Maybe I changed the subject. Maybe I sat down and tried to eat breakfast like nothing had happened. But inside, I was terrified. The entire time I was downstairs, I kept thinking about the bathroom. I pictured the person I had seen standing at the mirror. I tried to remember every detail. Had I really seen my mom's face? No, she had been turned away from me. I had only seen the back of her. I had seen her hair, her shoulders, her clothes, the way she stood. Everything about her looked like my mom. But she never turned around. She never answered me. She never acknowledged that I was there. That detail kept coming back to me. What if I had only assumed it was my mom because she was standing in a place where I expected my mom to be? What if I had seen someone else wearing something similar? What if I had been tired and mistaken a reflection, a shadow, or a piece of clothing for a person? That was what I tried to tell myself. Maybe the mirror and the low light had created an illusion. Maybe there was a towel hanging somewhere that looked like hair. Maybe the bathroom door had been partly open, and I saw my own reflection at an angle without realizing it. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe I had sleepwalked out of my room and dreamed the whole thing. There were many possible explanations, but none of them fit the feeling of the moment. I did not see a vague shadow. I did not see something in the corner of my eye. I saw a person standing in front of the mirror. I saw someone who looked exactly like my mom. Later, after breakfast, I went back upstairs. I did not want to. I honestly wanted to stay downstairs where the house felt busy and safe. The kitchen was full of light, sound, and movement. My mom was there. My family was there. Everything felt normal. But I also needed to know. I needed to look. I walked slowly up the stairs. Each step felt louder than it should have. I remember listening carefully for sounds upstairs. I expected to hear water running or someone moving inside the bathroom. I expected to hear a door close. There was nothing. When I reached the hallway, I stopped. The bathroom door was open. I could see inside. It was empty. The mirror reflected the sink, the counter, and part of the doorway. There was nobody standing there. No shadow behind the curtain, no movement near the cabinets, no sign that anyone had been in the room at all. The room looked exactly as it always did. Ordinary, still, empty. I stepped inside and looked around more carefully. I checked behind the shower curtain, even though I knew nobody could reasonably be hiding there. I looked toward the window. I looked at the door. I stared at the mirror for a while, almost expecting to see someone appear behind me. Nothing happened. But I could not shake the feeling that the bathroom had changed. Once you see something in a familiar room that should not be there, the room never feels completely familiar again. I started avoiding it when I could. Not in an obvious way. I still had to use the bathroom. I still brushed my teeth. I still went in there during the day. But I stopped lingering. I did not stand in front of the mirror for long. I kept the door open more often. I did not like being alone in there when the house was quiet. I especially hated looking into the mirror after that. Mirrors are strange when you are already scared. Normally, they are just mirrors. You use them without thinking. You look at yourself, brush your hair, wash your face, check your clothes, and move on. But after seeing someone who looked like my mom standing in front of that mirror, I began noticing how much of the room it reflected. If you stood at the sink, you could see the doorway behind you. You could see part of the hallway. You could see the shower curtain. You could see a dark corner that was not directly in your line of sight. Sometimes I would glance into it and feel my heart speed up, convinced I would see someone behind me. I never did. Not clearly. But the possibility stayed with me. I thought about telling my mom eventually. There were moments when I almost did. I would remember the incident while we were talking, and I would think, maybe I should tell her. Maybe she deserves to know someone else saw something, too. But then I remembered how frightened she had been by the feeling in the bathroom. I remembered her describing hands around her neck. I did not want to add to that fear. What would I even say? Mom, I saw someone who looked exactly like you in the bathroom, but you were downstairs the whole time. There was no way to say it without making it sound impossible, and I was not even sure I believed it myself. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. That explanation stayed with me for a long time. Maybe I had woken up, walked into the hallway, and started dreaming with my eyes open. Maybe I had seen the image of my mom because I expected her to be there. Maybe my mind had put her in the bathroom because she had told us so many times about feeling a presence there. Maybe I was projecting what I expected to see. That could happen. If you know someone is usually in the kitchen in the morning, your brain can fill in details. If you are tired, you can mistake shapes. If you are anxious, you can turn a reflection into a person. But there was something about the silence that bothered me. I had talked to her. Twice, I think. She did not answer. She did not turn around. She did not react. If it had been a simple misunderstanding, why did it feel like she was listening? Why did she look so much like my mom from behind? Why did I only realize something was wrong after I saw my real mom downstairs? I still do not know what happened. Maybe it was just a strange waking dream. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe I had carried too many of my mom's stories about the bathroom into my own mind, and when I walked past it, I saw exactly what I was afraid of seeing. Or maybe I saw something that wanted to look familiar. Something that stood in front of the mirror and wore my mom's shape because it knew that was the person I would expect to see. That is the thought that still makes my skin crawl. Not the idea of a ghost. Not even the idea of something in the bathroom. It is the idea that I saw my mother standing there, spoke to her, and did not realize until later that she had never been there at all. Even now, when I walk past the bathroom with the light on and see someone reflected in the mirror, I sometimes think about that morning. I remember the silent, figure at the sink. I remember the way it never turned around, and I remember finding my real mom downstairs, completely unaware that someone else had been standing in her place. When I was younger, I lived in a house that other kids insisted was haunted. I did not know whether I believed them at first. It was one of those things people say when they want to make an ordinary house sound more interesting. The kids who had known the family living there before us would talk about strange noises, weird feelings, and things that happened in certain rooms. They would say the people who lived there before us thought the house had something in it. At the time, I mostly treated it like a story. I was a kid, and kids love stories like that. You hear that a house might be haunted, and suddenly every creak in the hallway feels important. A pipe knocking in the wall becomes footsteps. A door settling in its frame becomes someone trying to get in. A shadow from a car passing outside becomes a person standing in the corner. Still, I did not think much about it during the day. During the day, it was just our house. It was the place where I slept, played games, watched TV, had friends over, annoyed my cousins, and did all the normal things kids do. My room was my favorite place in the house. It had my bed, my stuff, and enough floor space for people to hang out when friends stayed the night. One of the things hanging on my wall was an old Space Jam clock. I loved that clock. It was one of those things that felt extremely cool when you were a kid. It had the Space Jam design on it, and to me it was more than just something that told the time. It made my room feel like mine. It was part of the wall, part of the room, and part of all the nights I spent in there, playing, talking, or trying to fall asleep. The clock hung across the room from my bed. If I was lying down, it was maybe 10 feet away from me, on the far wall. My bed was against one side of the room, and there was enough space on the floor beside it for someone to sleep over. That was where my friend slept one night when he came to stay at my house. He had a blanket and a pillow on the floor next to my bed. We were doing what kids do at sleepovers. We were trying to stay awake longer than we were supposed to. We talked about random things, laughed at stupid stuff, probably played games or watched something before bed, then kept talking after the lights were off. Eventually, like most sleepovers, the conversation somehow turned into ghosts. We started talking about haunted houses, creepy stories, weird sounds, and whether either of us had ever seen anything strange. Then we started talking about my house. I told him what the other kids had said. I told him that people who knew the previous family claimed the house was haunted. I do not remember every story they had told, but I remember the general idea. Apparently, strange things had happened there before we moved in, things that made people uncomfortable, things that made the house seem like it had a reputation. My friend was interested, but I do not know whether he believed any of it. We were kids, so it was probably half scary and half funny. We would say things like, "What if someone is standing outside the room right now?" Then we would laugh, but still listen harder to the hallway afterward. The room was dark. The only light probably came from outside, maybe a little bit through the curtains, enough to make out the shape of furniture, but not much else. I remember lying in bed and trying to get comfortable while my friend was on the floor beside me. We kept talking for a while. Eventually, I started getting sleepy. The conversation slowed down. We were both tired. My friend's voice got quieter. Mine probably did too. I remember being right at that point where you are still aware of the room around you, but sleep is beginning to pull you under. Then I heard a loud bang. It was sudden enough that it snapped me awake. At first, I did not know what it was. The sound was hard and sharp, like something solid had struck the floor or a wall. It was not a small creak. It was not the house settling. It sounded like an object had been thrown. Before I could sit up properly, my friend said my name. He sounded scared and angry at the same time. He asked me if I had thrown the Space Jam clock at him. For a second, I did not understand what he meant. I was half asleep. I had just heard the banging sound, and my mind was still trying to figure out where it came from. Then I remembered the clock. It had been hanging across the room. I told him no. I said I had been sleeping. He did not believe me. He thought I had grabbed the clock and thrown it at him as some kind of joke. From his point of view, I guess it made sense. We had been talking about ghosts. The room was dark. Then suddenly the clock came crashing down near him. It would have been easy to assume I was trying to scare him. But I had not gotten out of bed. I had not touched the clock. I had been lying there, almost asleep, when it happened. The clock had somehow come off the wall and landed close enough to him that he thought I had thrown it. I remember trying to explain that I was not messing with him. I probably told him I had been asleep. I probably said there was no way I could have reached it without him noticing. The clock was on the other side of the room. Even if I had wanted to pull some joke, I would have had to get out of bed, cross the room in the dark, take it down, then throw it. My friend was right beside my bed. He would have heard me move. But he did not believe me. He stayed convinced that I had done it. Maybe he thought I had waited until he was drifting off. Maybe he thought I had somehow quietly slipped out of bed. Maybe he thought the haunted house story was just something I was using to make the prank seem better. Every time I brought it up after that, he would tell me I was full of it. He said I was messing with him. He said I had thrown the clock. And honestly, I could never prove otherwise. There was no video. There was no way to show him that I had not moved. All I knew was that I had heard the bang at the same time he did, and I had no memory of touching the clock at all. I do not remember whether we went back to sleep easily after that. Knowing us, we probably talked about it for a while. Maybe we got more scared because we had already been discussing ghosts. Maybe we checked the wall where the clock had been hanging. Maybe we looked at the hook, the nail, or whatever had been holding it up. There could have been a simple explanation. Maybe the hook had been loose. Maybe the clock had been hanging badly for a long time. Maybe the nail had slowly pulled free from the wall. Maybe the clock fell at the exact wrong time, and because it landed close to my friend, he assumed I had thrown it. That is possible. It is probably the explanation most people would give, but it still felt strange that it happened right after we started talking about the house being haunted. It felt strange that the clock came down with enough force to make my friend think it had been thrown at him. And it felt strange that even though he was right beside me, he never heard me get out of bed. That was the first thing that made me wonder whether the stories about the house might have been more than stories. The second thing happened another time, with my cousin. It was not a sleepover exactly, but we were hanging out in my room. I do not remember what we had been doing before it happened. We may have been watching TV, playing games, talking, or just being bored, but I remember the positions we were in clearly. My cousin was sitting or lying in my bed. I was on the floor. He had an orange soda can in his hand. I do not know why I did it, but at some point I slapped the can straight up out of his hand. Not across the room, not toward the wall, straight up. It was probably meant to be a stupid little move, the kind of thing cousins do to annoy each other. I may have thought the can would fly up a little, bounce off something, and fall down. Maybe I expected soda to spill everywhere and for us both to panic because of the carpet. But the second I hit it, something went wrong. Or at least, wrong in a way I still cannot explain. The can left his hand. Then, it did not come down. At first, I thought I had simply lost sight of it. The room was not huge, but it was big enough that a can could disappear into the darkness above or behind furniture for a moment. I thought maybe it had landed on the bed, bounced behind something, or rolled under a chair. But then we waited. There was silence. Not the sound of a can hitting the ground, not the sound of soda spilling, not the sound of aluminum bouncing off furniture. Nothing. A few seconds passed. That does not sound like a long time when you read it, but it felt incredibly long in the moment. I had just smacked a soda can out of my cousin's hand. A normal can should have come down immediately. Even if I slapped it hard, gravity should have done its job. It should have hit the floor in less than a second. Instead, there was nothing. My cousin looked around. I looked around. I remember saying something like, "Where'd it go?" It sounds funny now, but I was genuinely confused. The can had been there 1 second. Then it was gone. We both stared around the room, waiting to hear it land. Then, after what felt like way too long, it finally crashed down. The sound was loud. The can hit the floor somewhere nearby, and both of us reacted immediately. We both said something like, "What the frick?" at the same time. We were not even trying to sound dramatic. We were just shocked. The room had been silent for long enough that both of us had started wondering whether the can had somehow vanished. Then, it suddenly dropped out of nowhere. I turned the light on as fast as I could. Part of me expected to find orange soda everywhere. I expected a mess on the carpet. I expected the can to be dented, rolling around, spraying soda, or lying on its side with sticky orange liquid spreading underneath it. But the can had landed upright, perfectly upright. It was sitting there like someone had carefully placed it down. And somehow, it had not spilled. That was the part that made the whole thing feel even stranger. I had slapped it straight up. It had disappeared for several seconds. Then it came down and landed upright without staining my carpet. It felt impossible. We both stared at it. I do not remember whether we touched it right away. I think we probably did. We may have checked whether it was still full. We may have looked at the ceiling, trying to figure out if it had hit something and gotten stuck somehow. But there was nothing. No shelf above us. No place it could have rested. No obvious explanation for why it took so long to fall. Maybe the room was darker than I remember, and the can landed somewhere soft before dropping again. Maybe it bounced off a bed frame or piece of furniture in a way neither of us noticed. Maybe it got caught in a blanket, curtain, or some part of the room before slipping loose. But I do not remember anything like that. I remember silence. I remember wondering where it had gone. Then, I remember it dropping straight down and landing upright. After that, the house felt different to me. Not terrifying all the time. I did not spend every night hiding under my blankets or refusing to go into my room. In fact, I loved that house. I have a lot of good memories there. Friends came over. Family came over. I had fun in that room. I spent years there growing up. But there were moments when I would remember the clock. There were moments when I would remember the orange soda can. And then I would think about what the kids had said when we first moved in, that the house was haunted. The strange thing about haunted house stories is that they always sound silly until something happens directly in front of you. Before the Space Jam clock fell, I probably would have laughed if someone told me an object flew across their room. Before the soda can stayed in the air longer than it should have, I probably would have assumed they were exaggerating. But when you are there, it feels different. You remember the sound. You remember who was beside you. You remember the silence after something should have happened, but did not. And you remember how both people in the room reacted at the same time. I think that is why those two incidents stayed with me. They were not things I experienced alone. My friend was there for the clock. My cousin was there for the soda can. Neither of them had heard my version before it happened. Neither of them was looking for something spooky. Both of them reacted naturally, before there was time to make a story out of it. My friend thought I had thrown the clock because it genuinely looked like someone had thrown it. My cousin and I both stared at the empty space after the soda can vanished because neither of us understood where it had gone. The house had other little things, too. Nothing I could prove. There were sounds that seemed louder at night. There were times when a room felt colder than the rest of the house. There were moments when you thought you heard somebody moving in another part of the house, only to find nobody there. But houses make noises. Old walls creak. Pipes knock. Doors shift. Furniture settles. And when you grow up hearing that your house might be haunted, you can start treating every normal thing like evidence. I know that. I know memory can make things feel stranger over time. Maybe the clock really did fall off a bad hook. Maybe my friend only thought it had been thrown because he had been lying on the floor near where it landed. Maybe the soda can caught on something for a second, and our kid brains turned 2 seconds into 10. Maybe it bounced in a way that made it seem impossible. Maybe there was always a normal reason. But the memories still feel real. I can still picture my friend lying on the floor next to my bed, calling my name after the bang. I can still picture the Space Jam clock across the room. I can still remember how annoyed he got when I insisted I had not thrown it. And I can still picture the orange soda can standing upright on the carpet after it finally came down. The fact that it did not spill almost felt like a joke. Like whatever had happened decided to be polite enough not to ruin the carpet. That house never felt fully scary to me. That is why I miss it. It was strange. Sure, it had moments that made no sense. It had nights where the dark felt a little too quiet and rooms felt a little too still. But it was also home. I grew up there. I had sleepovers there. I laughed there. I had stupid fights with cousins there. I watched TV, stayed up too late, and made memories that had nothing to do with ghosts. Maybe that is why the weird things do not make me hate the place. They are just part of the story now. A Space Jam clock that fell like it had been thrown. An orange soda can that disappeared into thin air for a few seconds. And a house that may or may not have had something in it, but somehow always felt like it belonged to us anyway. More than 10 years ago, when I still lived with my parents, but I remember it more clearly than many things that happened much later in my life. At the time, my bedroom was at the very end of a hallway. My parents' bedroom was right next to mine, close enough that they could usually hear if I opened my door or moved around during the night. The hallway was not particularly long, but at night, with all the lights switched off, it always seemed darker and narrower than it did during the day. My father worked the night shift, so he was not home when this happened. It was only my mother and me in the house, along with my parents' cats. I always closed my bedroom door before going to sleep. It was not because I was afraid of the hallway or because I wanted privacy. I closed it because of the cats. If I left the door open, they would come into my room throughout the night. They would jump onto the bed, walk across me, knock things over, or scratch at something until I woke up. Closing the door was part of my normal bedtime routine. I would go into my room, shut the door firmly, and make sure it had caught properly. I had done it so many times that I did not need to think about it. That night was no different. I went to bed with the door closed. I do not remember having trouble falling asleep. There was nothing unusual happening in the house. My mother was asleep in the room next door, my father was at work, and the cats were somewhere outside my room. Everything was quiet. Sometime during the night, I woke suddenly. The first thing I noticed was the sound of someone running down the hallway. The footsteps were fast and heavy enough to wake me completely. They did not sound like a cat moving across the floor. Cats can make surprising amounts of noise when they run, especially in a quiet house. But this was different. It sounded like a person. The footsteps came quickly down the hallway toward my bedroom. There was no slow approach and no hesitation. Whoever was running seemed to be moving at full speed. I opened my eyes. A girl was directly in front of my face. She was so close that I did not have time to wonder how she had entered the room. Her face filled most of my vision. She had extremely pale skin and long black hair. The contrast between her skin and hair made her look even more disturbing in the darkness. She was not standing across the room or watching me from the doorway. She was right beside the bed, leaning close enough that I could see her clearly. For one terrible moment, I could not understand what I was looking at. I had only just woken up. My mind was still trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Part of me believed I was still dreaming, but the room around her looked real. I could see my bed. I could see the shadows on the walls. I knew I was awake in my own bedroom. The girl said something to me. I know her mouth moved, and I remember hearing her voice. But I cannot remember the words. That detail has always frustrated me. The incident stayed with me so clearly, yet the one thing she said disappeared from my memory almost immediately. I do not know whether she whispered, warned me, asked me something, or simply said my name. I only remember that she spoke. Then, I felt her hands on my arm. That was the part that made the experience feel completely real. I did not only see her, I felt her touching me. Her hands were on my arm firmly enough that I knew where her fingers were. The sensation was not vague or distant. It felt like another person had reached out and taken hold of me. I was terrified. I do not remember screaming. I do not remember trying to pull away. Everything happened too quickly. I blinked. The girl was gone. There was no movement toward the doorway. There was no shadow crossing the room. She did not step back or release my arm gradually. One moment, she was face to face with me. The next moment, I was alone. I stared into the darkness where she had been. My arm still felt as though someone had touched it. The room was silent. I looked toward the door, but I could not see anyone standing there. I listened for footsteps in the hallway, expecting to hear the girl running away. Nothing moved. I sat there trying to breathe normally. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed impossible my mother could not hear it through the wall. I reached for the clock and looked at the time. It was 3:01 in the morning. Seeing the time made the whole experience feel even more fixed and real. I was not waking at an uncertain hour with no idea whether it was still night or nearly morning. It was exactly 3:01. I remember that number because I kept looking at it. The clock was one of the few normal things in the room. The glowing numbers gave me something solid to focus on while I tried to understand what had happened. Then, without warning, I became overwhelmed with emotion. I started crying. It was not only fear. It felt like a wave of sadness had entered me all at once. I had no clear reason for it. I was frightened, obviously, but the reaction felt much deeper than ordinary fear. It was as though something had opened inside me and released grief that I could not control. I began sobbing. I tried to stay quiet because my mother was asleep in the next room, but I could not stop immediately. I pulled the blankets close and sat in bed, crying in the dark. The feeling was so intense that it seemed to belong to someone else. I was confused, frightened, and deeply sad at the same time. Eventually, I began trying to explain the experience to myself. I had suffered from sleep paralysis for years. I knew how strange it could be. During sleep paralysis, a person can wake while the body is still partly asleep. They may be unable to move. They may see figures in the room, hear voices, feel pressure, or believe someone is touching them. The experience can feel completely real, even when nothing is physically there. I had experienced frightening episodes before. Sometimes I woke unable to move. Sometimes I felt as though someone was in the room. I knew the brain could create terrifying images during the space between sleep and waking. The pale girl could have been part of an episode. The sound of footsteps could have been a hallucination. The feeling of hands on my arm could have been my mind misinterpreting pressure from the blanket or the position of my body. That explanation was frightening, but it was also comforting. Sleep paralysis was something I understood. It meant there had been no real person in my room. It meant nobody had entered the house. It meant the girl had never touched me. I kept repeating that idea to myself. It was only a bad episode. I had woken too quickly. My brain had continued dreaming for a few seconds. Nothing was there. Even while telling myself that, I remained uneasy. The experience had felt different from my usual sleep paralysis. I do not clearly remember being unable to move. I had opened my eyes, seen the girl, and then watched her vanish when I blinked. Still, I preferred the sleep paralysis explanation. Anything was better than believing a pale stranger had been standing beside my bed at 3 in the morning. After some time, I calmed down. My breathing slowed, and the sadness became less intense. I did not turn on the light. I did not leave the room to wake my mother. I do not know why I stayed there alone. Perhaps I was embarrassed. Perhaps I thought my mother would tell me it had only been a dream. Maybe I feared that opening the door would reveal the girl standing in the hallway. Eventually, I lay back down. I stayed awake for a while, listening to the house. I heard no more running. The door did not move. No one spoke to me again. At some point, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was coming into the room. The night felt distant for a moment. Daylight has a way of making strange experiences seem less powerful. Shadows become furniture again. The corners of the room look harmless. The hallway is only a hallway. I sat up and looked toward my bedroom door. It was partly open. The door was ajar, leaving a narrow gap between the bedroom and the hallway. I stared at it. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. I always closed it. If it had been open all night, the cats would almost certainly have come into my room and disturbed me. Yet, I did not remember them doing that. I also did not remember opening the door during the night. I had stayed in bed after seeing the girl. At least, that was what I believed. The partly open door made the memory return immediately. The running footsteps, the pale face, the black hair, the voice I could not understand, the hands on my arm. I felt sadness again. It came suddenly, almost like the emotion I had experienced during the night. I did not start sobbing this time, but I felt strangely low and uncomfortable. I told myself the door might not have closed properly. Maybe one of the cats had pushed it open. Maybe my mother had checked on me after hearing me cry. Maybe I had opened it myself and forgotten. There were several ordinary possibilities. I pushed the thoughts away and started my morning. I got dressed, left the bedroom, and went through my normal routine. The house looked fine. There was no sign of anyone having entered. Nothing was missing. The windows and doors appeared secure. The hallway where I had heard the running looked completely ordinary. I tried not to think about the night. A little later, my mother woke up. As soon as she saw me, she was annoyed. She began giving me a hard time for waking her during the night. At first, I did not understand what she meant. I thought she might have heard me crying. I had tried to stay quiet, but the rooms were close together. It was possible that my sobbing had carried through the wall. Then she told me what she had heard. She said I had been running down the hallway at around 3 in the morning. I stopped listening to everything else. I asked her what she meant. She repeated that she had heard me running. The footsteps had been loud enough to wake her. She believed I had left my bedroom and run down the hallway in the middle of the night. But I had not. At least I had no memory of doing it. My memory began with the sound of someone else running toward my room. I had opened my eyes and seen the girl. From my point of view, I had been lying in bed the entire time. My mother's version changed the experience completely. Until that moment, I could explain everything as sleep paralysis. The girl had been a hallucination. Her hands had been part of the episode. Her voice had been created by my half-dreaming mind. But my mother had been awake in the next room. She had heard running in the hallway at the same time. The sound was not only inside my dream. I asked whether she had seen me. She had not. She had only heard the footsteps. She assumed they were mine because my father was working and there was no one else in the house. I told her I had never left the bed. I explained that the running had woken me. I told her about the girl standing beside me. I described her pale face and black hair. I told my mother that the girl had spoken and touched my arm before disappearing. I do not remember exactly how my mother reacted. She may have thought I had been sleepwalking. That would have been a reasonable explanation. A person can walk or run while asleep and have no memory of it the next morning. Perhaps I left my room, ran through the hallway, returned to bed, and then woke during a nightmare. Maybe the girl was something I saw while waking from a sleepwalking episode. That could also explain the open bedroom door. I may have opened it myself. But the timing did not feel right to me. I heard the footsteps approaching. I did not experience them as my own movement. I woke in bed while the sound was still happening. Then the girl was immediately in front of me. If I had been the person running, how did I hear the footsteps while lying in bed? Maybe my sleeping brain placed the sound in the wrong order. Maybe the footsteps were the last thing I heard as I climbed back into bed, and my mind turned them into someone running toward me. Dreams do that. They take real sounds and build them into a story. A phone ringing becomes an alarm in a dream. A person speaking nearby becomes a voice from an imagined character. It is possible that my own footsteps became the sound of the girl approaching. Still, the explanation never fully satisfied me. If I had been sleepwalking, why did my mother hear me running instead of walking? Why would I run down a dark hallway at 3 in the morning? Where had I gone? Why did I return to bed? And why did I wake with such overwhelming sadness? There was no way to prove anything. My father had been at work. The cats could not tell us what happened. My mother had only heard the sound. I had only seen the girl. Neither of us had the complete event. For my mother, I ran through the hallway. For me, something ran toward my bedroom. The bedroom door was open the next morning, but that only created more questions. Over the years, I have considered every explanation I can think of. Sleep paralysis remains the most likely one. The girl had many qualities common in sleep paralysis hallucinations. She appeared suddenly, stood close to me, spoke, and touched me. Then, she disappeared when I blinked. The feeling of a presence in the room is extremely common during those episodes. People often see human figures, dark shadows, or faces. The brain is awake enough to recognize the bedroom, but still dreaming enough to place someone inside it. My history of sleep paralysis makes that explanation even stronger. The running could have been a separate event. Maybe one of the cats raced down the hallway and sounded heavier than usual. In the silence of the night, small animals can sound surprisingly loud. My mother may have assumed the footsteps belonged to me because she was half asleep. The door may have been pushed open by a cat. Everything could have been ordinary events happening close together. But my mother was certain she heard me running. I was certain I heard someone running toward me. Those two memories have never fit together. Another possibility is sleepwalking. Maybe I left my room without waking. I ran down the hallway, returned, and left the door open. My mother heard me. Then I woke in a confused state and experienced sleep paralysis. That explanation connects most of the evidence. It explains the footsteps, the open door, and my lack of memory. But I still struggle with the order. My memory begins with the footsteps. I did not wake afterward in a different position or near the door. I woke in bed and saw the girl inches from my face. I felt her hands on my arm. The physical sensation was so clear that even now I can remember where she touched me. I also cannot explain the sadness. Fear would have made sense. I had seen something terrifying. But the emotion that came over me felt more like grief. It was immediate and uncontrollable. I did not know the girl. I had no reason to mourn her. Yet I cried as if something terrible had happened. The same sadness returned the next morning when I saw the door open. Even now, more than 10 years later, thinking about the event can make me cry. That reaction is not something I choose. The memory brings the feeling back before I can stop it. I can discuss other frightening experiences without becoming emotional. This one is different. The image of the girl does not only scare me, it hurts. I have wondered whether she was trying to tell me something. I cannot remember her words, and that may be the most disturbing part. Maybe the message was meaningless, only dream speech created by my brain. Maybe I never truly heard words at all. But I remember knowing she had spoken. Sometimes I try to force the memory to return. I picture her face. I remember the black hair. I imagine the movement of her mouth. The words never come back. There is only a blank place where her voice should be. I also wonder whether my mother heard the girl running instead of me. She assumed the footsteps were mine because only two people were supposed to be home. If there had been another person in the hallway, my mother had no reason to consider it. She heard running and thought her child was awake. But what if I had not been the one moving? What if the sound that woke both of us came from something entering my room? That is the explanation I try not to think about. A real intruder seems unlikely. The house was secure. Nothing was stolen. No one was found. A human person could not vanish when I blinked. The girl was almost certainly connected to sleep. But the footsteps remain. Maybe the entire thing was a rare combination of sleepwalking and sleep paralysis. Perhaps I ran through the hallway while unconscious, returned to bed, and woke into a hallucination. My own actions frightened me because I had no memory of them. That explanation is strange, but it is possible. I prefer it to anything supernatural. Still, preferring an explanation does not make it feel true. More than a decade has passed. I have lived through many nights since then. I have experienced other episodes of sleep paralysis. None affected me in the same way. None left me crying whenever I remembered them. None included another person in the house hearing part of the experience. The memory remains sharp. I can still see the dark room. I can hear the footsteps rushing down the hallway. I can see the pale girl inches from my face. I can feel her hands on my arm. I can see the clock showing 3:01. Then I remember waking the next morning and finding the door open. Finally, I hear my mother telling me that I had woken her because she heard me running at 3 in the morning. I do not know what happened. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was experiencing one of the worst sleep paralysis episodes of my life. Maybe my mother heard a cat and mistook it for me. Maybe the open door had an ordinary explanation. Any one of those things could be true. But when I put them together, the story still does not make sense. I heard someone running toward my room. My mother heard me running in the hallway. I never remembered leaving my bed. A girl appeared close enough to touch me. She said something I could never remember. Then she vanished. The door was open in the morning, and more than 10 years later, the memory still brings back the same overwhelming sadness. I can explain the fear. I have never been able to explain the grief.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
The most disturbing part is not the stopped car. It is the same car returning, with a woman gone. I am keeping that uncertainty intact and strengthening the sequence without changing the event. This happened sometime in the mid-1990s, and even now I still do not know what we saw that night. A few friends and I had gone to see a band, and by the time the show ended and we started driving home, it was somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. We had been out for hours, and everyone was tired. I was driving. We were on the interstate, probably I-40, traveling through a long, dark stretch of road. At that time of night, there was almost no traffic. We had not seen another vehicle for quite a while. The darkness outside seemed endless. There were no nearby buildings, bright signs, or busy exits. The headlights showed the road directly in front of us, but everything beyond their reach was black. Inside the car, we were talking and listening to music. The conversation was not about anything important. My friends were mainly trying to keep me awake and alert because we still had some distance to travel. I was tired, but I was not falling asleep. I remember watching the road carefully. I was not drifting between lanes or struggling to keep my eyes open. I knew how dangerous it could be to drive while exhausted, so I was paying attention. The speed limit was probably around 65 miles per hour at the time. I have never been a serious speeder, but I may have been traveling somewhere between 70 and 75. That was normal for the interstate. The road ahead appeared completely empty. Then, without warning, a car appeared directly in front of us. It was stopped in the middle of our lane. It had no headlights on, no tail lights, no hazard lights. There was nothing to warn me that it was there. 1 second, I was driving along an empty road. The next, I was about to crash into the back of a motionless car at highway speed. I shouted several words that I will not repeat politely. My hands moved before I had time to think. I turned the wheel hard and swerved into the next lane. For one terrible moment, I believed we were going to hit it anyway. The front of my car passed dangerously close to its rear corner. I do not know exactly how little space there was between us, but it felt like inches. My friends were thrown sideways in their seats. Someone shouted. The tires made a rough sound against the road as I fought to keep control. If another vehicle had been beside us, we probably would have crashed. Fortunately, the interstate was empty. I managed to move around the stopped car without losing control. As we passed it, I looked through the side window. I was angry and confused. Who stops a car in the middle of an interstate lane at 3 or 4 in the morning without turning on any lights? I expected the vehicle to be empty. Maybe it had broken down and the driver had gone for help. Maybe the battery had died. Maybe someone had abandoned it after an accident. Instead, the interior light was on. The inside of the car was clearly visible for the brief moment we passed. A man was sitting behind the steering wheel. He was facing forward. He did not turn toward us. He did not raise a hand or react to the fact that we had nearly crashed into him. He simply sat there, completely still. There was a woman in the passenger seat. At least I believed she was a woman. Her position was strange enough that I had trouble understanding what I was seeing. Her hips and lower body appeared to be sitting in the passenger seat normally. Her legs were raised, with her feet resting against or near the dashboard. But her legs were spread wide apart. Her feet pointed upward and slightly outward. Her upper body was twisted toward the driver. Her face rested against his shoulder. She did not move either. At first, the position looked almost intimate. It could have been two people fooling around or resting together. But something about her body looked wrong. Her upper half seemed too loose. Her head was not resting naturally. It looked heavy, as though it had fallen against the man's shoulder and stayed there. The man continued staring straight ahead. Neither of them reacted as we passed. We were moving quickly, so I only saw them for a second or two. Then, the stopped car disappeared behind us. I straightened the wheel and returned fully to our lane. My heart was pounding. For a few moments, no one inside our car said anything. That silence was unusual. We had just narrowly avoided a serious crash, yet nobody immediately shouted, laughed nervously, or asked what had happened. We were all trying to understand what we had seen. I kept driving. I looked into the rearview mirror, but the car was already lost in the darkness. It had no lights, so there was almost nothing to see behind us. My first thought was that the woman had looked dead. I did not say it aloud. I immediately began trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe the two of them had pulled over for some reason, even though they had stopped in the worst possible place. Perhaps they had been fooling around before we approached. Her legs may have been raised because she had been sitting strangely. Her head may have been on his shoulder because she was resting. I told myself that the quick glimpse had confused me. We had passed at 70 miles per hour. The interior light, the sudden fear, and the movement of our own car could have made the scene appear stranger than it really was. There had to be a normal explanation. I repeated those ideas silently while trying to keep my attention on the road. Then one of my friends spoke from the back seat. Was that lady dead? The question made my stomach drop. Until that moment, I could have dismissed the thought as my own imagination. But someone else had seen the same thing. We all started talking at once. Everyone had noticed the woman's position. Everyone thought there was something wrong with the way she had been lying against the driver. One friend said she had not moved at all. Another said the man had looked too calm. We all agreed that the scene did not look normal. The car had been sitting in the middle of the lane with no exterior lights, but the inside light had been turned on. The man sat upright, facing the road. The woman appeared to be folded toward him, completely motionless. We began discussing whether we should find a phone and call the police. This happened in the mid-1990s, before everyone carried a mobile phone. If we wanted to report something, we would have needed to find an open gas station, a payphone, or an exit with some kind of service. We were still talking about what to do when headlights suddenly appeared behind us. They were moving fast. At first, I assumed another car had finally joined the road. Then the vehicle drew closer. It was traveling much faster than we were. The headlights filled my mirrors, and within seconds, the car moved into the lane beside us. As it passed, I recognized it. It was the same car. There was no doubt in my mind. Only a short time earlier, it had been sitting without lights in the middle of the road. Now it was speeding past us. The change made no sense. We had not seen it start moving. We had not noticed headlights behind us until it was already approaching quickly. It must have accelerated hard to catch us. The interior light was still on. That allowed us another brief view inside as the vehicle passed. The man was still driving. The woman was gone. The passenger seat appeared empty. I did not see her sitting normally. I did not see her lying down. There was no head resting against the man's shoulder. She was simply no longer there. The man had both wrists or forearms positioned near the top of the steering wheel. In one hand, he appeared to be holding a knife. In the other, he had some kind of cloth. It looked as though he was wiping or cleaning the blade while driving. That is what everyone in our car believed we saw. Again, the moment lasted only seconds. The car was moving extremely fast, and we were looking through separate windows from a moving vehicle. It is possible that the object was not a knife. It might have been a tool, food, or something else that reflected the light. The cloth could have been paper or clothing, but to us, it looked like a knife being wiped clean. Nobody spoke as the car pulled ahead. We watched its tail lights disappear into the darkness. This time, its exterior lights were working. That made the earlier situation even stranger. The car had been capable of using its lights. They had simply been switched off while it sat in the middle of the interstate. The interior light remained on both times. The first time, it illuminated the man and the motionless woman. The second time, it showed the man alone, apparently cleaning a blade. The entire car became quiet. We were no longer laughing or talking ourselves into harmless explanations. Someone asked where the woman had gone. Nobody had an answer. There had not been enough time for the man to drop her off somewhere far away. The road was mostly empty, and we had not passed a clear exit or building where she could have safely left the car. Even if there had been an exit, why would the driver first stop without lights in the middle of the lane? Why would the woman appear lifeless? Why would the car then catch us at such high speed? We began imagining terrible possibilities. Maybe we had driven past a murder. Maybe the woman had already been dead when we saw her. Maybe the driver had stopped because he was moving her body or doing something inside the vehicle. Perhaps our arrival surprised him. Maybe he turned off the exterior lights because he did not want to be noticed. Then, after we passed, he moved the woman somewhere else and raced after us. The idea that he had followed us was frightening. He may have realized we had seen him. He might have been trying to look inside our car and count how many witnesses there were. He could have memorized our license plate. For a while, I expected to see his brake lights ahead. I thought he might slow down and wait for us. I imagined the car stopping across the road or following us off the next exit. Instead, he continued speeding away. Soon, we could no longer see him. We debated turning around, but going back would have meant returning to the place where we had first seen the car. If the woman had been left beside the road, she might have needed help. On the other hand, if the driver was dangerous, returning could have placed all of us at risk. We were young, tired, and frightened. We had no mobile phone. I do not remember whether we eventually reported it. If we did, I never heard what police found. There was no clear ending. No news report reached us. We never learned the driver's identity. We never found out whether a woman had gone missing that night. For years, I replayed the scene in my mind. Each time, I tried to find a harmless explanation. Maybe the car had suffered an electrical failure. The driver may have stopped suddenly because the engine or exterior lights had gone out. The interior light might have switched on automatically when a door opened. Perhaps the woman was only sleeping in an awkward position. Maybe she felt sick and rested her head against the driver. After we passed, the electrical problem may have corrected itself. The woman might have lowered herself below the window, explaining why we could not see her the second time. The object in the man's hand could have been a small knife used for food. Maybe he had been peeling or cutting an apple. The cloth could have been a napkin. That is the most innocent version. A man stopped because of car trouble. His companion rested in the passenger seat. After fixing the problem, he drove away quickly. While driving, he wiped a small food knife. Nothing criminal happened. We misunderstood everything because it was dark, we were tired, and we only saw the car for a few seconds. I would like to believe that. But several details still trouble me. The car was not stopped on the shoulder. It was directly in the lane. There were no hazards. The exterior lights were completely off. The driver did not react when we swerved around him. He did not turn his head or show concern that we had almost crashed into his vehicle. The woman's body looked unnaturally still. Then, when the car passed us again, she was no longer visible. If she had simply leaned down, why would she remain hidden while the car traveled at high speed? And why did every person in our vehicle independently believe the man was cleaning a knife? Memory is not perfect, especially after many years. The more people discuss an event, the more their versions can influence one another. One person may say, it looked like a knife, and eventually, everyone remembers seeing a knife clearly. That is possible. We were also coming home from a concert in the middle of the night. We were tired and may have been more frightened than we realized. The woman's position may not have been as strange as it seemed. The driver may not have been as calm. The object may not have been a weapon. I accept all of that. But even if every questionable detail has an innocent explanation, the event was still dangerous. A car was stopped without lights in the middle of an interstate lane. We nearly hit it at highway speed. That alone could have killed everyone involved. Had I reacted a second later, we would have crashed into the back of the vehicle. At 70 or 75 miles per hour, the impact would have been severe. The driver and woman could have died. My friends and I could have died. The fact that I managed to avoid the car still feels incredibly lucky. Sometimes I wonder whether the driver wanted someone to hit him. Perhaps the car had been deliberately placed there as part of an insurance scheme or some other crime. Maybe he hoped a vehicle would stop so he could rob the people inside. If we had pulled over immediately, we might have walked directly toward a dangerous situation. Instead, we swerved and continued. Then, the driver chased us. That explanation is frightening. But it would make more sense than a random mechanical failure. It might also explain why the woman disappeared. Perhaps she had never been injured. Maybe she had been part of a plan and simply moved out of sight. The man could have been holding something other than a knife. Still, their behavior would have been extremely dangerous and strange. Another possibility is that the woman was unconscious from alcohol or drugs. Her body may have looked lifeless because she could not control her posture. The man might have stopped in panic, then decided to keep driving. She may have fallen onto the floor while he accelerated, making the passenger seat appear empty. If the object was a knife, he might truly have been cutting food or using it for some unrelated task. That explanation is possible, but it does not make the situation feel normal. Driving at high speed while wiping a knife with an unconscious woman on the floor would still be terrifying. I have also wondered whether there were two similar cars. Maybe the vehicle that passed us was not the same one. At night, many cars look alike. Our minds might have connected them because the second appeared so soon after the first. But all of us believed it was the same vehicle. The shape, size, and interior lighting matched. The timing also fit. A different car would have needed to appear on an otherwise empty road only minutes later, also with the inside light on and a similar-looking driver. That seems less likely than the first car catching up to us. The memory that stays with me most is the woman's head resting against the man's shoulder. It did not look peaceful. There was no movement between them. The driver did not seem to support her or check whether she was all right. He looked straight ahead as if she were not there. Then she was gone. Sometimes I think we may have witnessed the final stage of something terrible without understanding it. Maybe the woman had been killed before we arrived. Maybe the driver had stopped because he was deciding what to do with her body. Our car appeared unexpectedly, forcing him to move. He may have placed her in the back seat, boot, or beside the road. Then he accelerated past us while cleaning the weapon. That is the darkest explanation. There is no proof it happened. I never saw blood. I never saw the man attack anyone. I never saw where the woman went. All I witnessed was an unusual position, an empty passenger seat, and an object that looked like a knife. It would be irresponsible to say with certainty that we saw a murder, but it would also be dishonest to pretend the thought never crossed our minds. Everyone in the car had the same reaction. First, we wondered whether the woman was dead. Then the car passed us, and she was missing. For the rest of the drive, I kept watching my mirrors. Every set of headlights made me tense. I worried the car would return. I imagined the man following us home. I thought about what we would do if he forced us off the road. My friends tried to stay alert and watch behind us. The music no longer helped. The atmosphere inside our car had completely changed. We had started the drive tired, but relaxed, talking about the concert. After the encounter, nobody wanted to joke. We had seen something that none of us could explain. Eventually, we reached a safer, more populated area. The road gained more traffic. There were lights, open businesses, and other people around. Only then did I begin to feel that the man was not coming back. We arrived home without seeing the car again. Nothing happened to us afterward. No stranger appeared at the house. No police contacted us. There was no report that confirmed or disproved our fears. The event became one of those stories we told over the years, usually ending with the same uncomfortable joke. Maybe we saw a murder on I-40. Or maybe a man stopped in the middle of the interstate to peel an apple while his lady friend took a very strange nap. The joke makes the story easier to tell. It gives people permission to laugh instead of sitting with the uncertainty. But when I remember the actual night, it is not funny. I remember the black road. I remember the sudden dark shape of the stopped car filling my headlights. I remember turning the wheel and narrowly avoiding the crash. I remember the interior light showing the man staring forward. I remember the woman's feet raised on the dashboard, her legs spread, and her upper body twisted toward him. I remember her face lying against his shoulder. Then I remember the silence inside our car until my friend asked the question we were all thinking. Was that lady dead? Most of all, I remember the same vehicle racing past us later. The passenger seat looked empty. The interior light was still on. The man appeared to have a knife in one hand and a cloth in the other. He never looked at us. He simply sped into the darkness and disappeared. I still do not know what we saw. Maybe every part of it had an ordinary explanation. I hope it did. But after all these years, I have never been able to think of an innocent explanation that accounts for everything. A car stopped without lights in the middle of an empty interstate. A motionless woman rested against the driver. The vehicle later caught us at high speed. The woman was no longer visible, and the man appeared to be wiping a knife clean as he passed. When I was somewhere between 6 and 8 years old, and although I had almost completely forgotten about it for years, the memory came back to me recently with surprising clarity. At that age, my bedtime routine was extremely predictable. Every night, my parents would put me to bed at around 8 o'clock. One of them would usually help me get settled, make sure I had everything I needed, and then say goodnight before leaving the room. Afterward, my mother and father would normally spend another couple of hours in the living room. They might watch television, talk, or relax before going to bed themselves. Because this happened every night, I knew the sounds of the house well. I knew what the television sounded like from my bedroom. I knew how my father laughed when he found something funny. I knew the sound of people moving around in the living room and the way their voices traveled through the hallway. Nothing about that night seemed unusual when I went to bed. My parents followed the same routine they always did. I was tired, comfortable, and not worried about anything. I remember falling asleep quickly. Sometime later, probably about an hour and a half after I had gone to bed, I woke up. The room was dark, but I could hear noise coming from the living room. The first thing I clearly remember was the sound of my father laughing. It was not a quiet sound that I could have mistaken for something else. It sounded like him. I recognized it immediately. Because I was a child, hearing that my father was still awake felt like an opportunity. I did not want to stay in bed if he was sitting in the living room watching television. I thought I might be able to join him for a little while, talk to him, or convince him to let me stay up later. At that age, any excuse to avoid going back to sleep seemed like a good one. I sat up in bed and listened. The television was definitely on. I could hear voices from an animated Star Wars show. I vividly remember hearing Obi-Wan and Anakin Skywalker speaking. The show was familiar to me, and I knew their voices. The dialogue seemed completely normal, as though an episode was playing in the living room while my father watched. That made me even more certain he was out there. I climbed out of bed. The layout of the hallway is important because I could not see the living room directly from inside my bedroom. My bedroom door was positioned at the end of a hallway that turned sharply, almost like the shape of the letter L. My room was on the short, hooked part of that shape. To reach the living room, I had to leave my bedroom, walk a short distance, turn around the bend, and then continue down the main section of the hallway. Because of the corner, I could see light coming from the living room before I could see the actual room. When I stepped toward my doorway, I saw the glow of the television shining down the hallway. The light flickered against the walls in the familiar way televisions do in a dark house. It changed slightly as the scenes on the screen changed. I was happy when I saw it. Everything confirmed what I already believed. My father was awake. The television was on. A Star Wars cartoon was playing. I had heard him laughing only moments earlier. I opened my bedroom door fully and stepped into the hallway. I could still hear the characters speaking. I began moving toward the bend. Then, just as I was about to turn the corner, the light disappeared. It did not slowly become dimmer. It cut out instantly. The television voices stopped at the same time. The hallway became dark and silent. I froze for a moment. My first thought was that my father had switched off the television. Maybe he had heard my bedroom door open and realized I was awake. Perhaps he did not want me coming into the living room, so he had quickly turned everything off and was preparing to send me back to bed. That would have been annoying, but it would have made sense. I waited for the sound of him moving. I expected to hear him place the remote control down, stand from the sofa, or walk toward the hallway. I heard nothing. There was another feeling I remember clearly, although it is difficult to explain. The moment the television light disappeared, it suddenly felt as though my father was no longer in the living room. I had no evidence for that thought. I had not yet turned the corner. I could not see the sofa. I had no reason to think the room was empty. But the feeling came immediately. A few seconds earlier, the house had felt occupied. I had heard my father and the television, and I knew someone was awake nearby. When the light disappeared, the entire atmosphere changed. The living room no longer felt like a room where my father was relaxing. It felt empty. I stood in the hallway, staring toward the corner. I considered turning around and going back to bed. Something already felt wrong, but I was still more curious than frightened. I told myself my father had simply turned off the television and gone into another room. Maybe he had gone to the kitchen. Maybe he was using the bathroom. Perhaps he had heard me walking and was waiting around the corner to surprise me. That last thought made me nervous, but it also seemed possible. Parents sometimes joke with children, and I wondered whether he was trying to scare me. I slowly continued down the hallway. The house was now completely quiet. The television had been loud enough for me to recognize specific characters only seconds earlier. The sudden silence felt unnatural. I reached the corner and looked into the main hallway. There was no one there. I continued toward the living room. I moved more slowly now. The floor felt cold beneath my feet, and every small sound I made seemed much louder than normal. I expected my father to appear at any moment. I thought he might step out from behind the wall and laugh because he had managed to frighten me. He did not. When I reached the living room, I found it empty. My father was not on the sofa. He was not standing near the television. He was not hiding behind a chair. The television was off. The screen was completely dark. There was no fading image, no sound, and no sign that it had been playing only moments earlier. I stared at it. I remember feeling confused before I felt afraid. I had heard the show. I had seen the light moving down the hallway. I had heard my father laughing. There was no question in my mind that the television had been on, yet now the room looked as though no one had been there for a long time. I called for my father. There was no answer. I said his name again, louder this time. Nothing. I looked toward the kitchen. It was dark. I checked the nearby areas, expecting him to step into view. He was nowhere. That was when the fear finally hit me. I realized that I was standing alone in a dark living room, and I did not know where my parents were. I also did not know what I had heard. The house that had seemed normal a few minutes earlier suddenly felt enormous. Every doorway looked black. The hallway behind me seemed longer than before. I thought someone might be hiding nearby, watching me. Maybe the laughter had not been my father. Maybe the voices had not come from the television. Those thoughts were too frightening to hold for long. I turned around and ran back toward my bedroom. I did not walk. I ran as fast as I could. I rounded the corner of the hallway, rushed through my doorway, and shut the door behind me. I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers around myself. My heart was beating hard. I listened for footsteps outside the room. I expected someone to follow me. I thought I might hear the television turn on again. Nothing happened. The house remained silent. I was too frightened to go back to sleep. I could not stop replaying the moment in my mind. My father's laugh. The voices of Obi-Wan and Anakin. The television glow on the walls. Then, the instant darkness. I tried to find an explanation that would make me feel safe. Maybe my father really had been watching television but had gone to bed quickly. Perhaps he turned it off, walked through another entrance, and reached his bedroom before I entered the living room. But the timing did not seem possible. The light went out when I was only a few steps from the corner. I reached the living room soon afterward. I should have heard him moving. I should have seen him somewhere in the hallway. Maybe he had gone to the bathroom, but I had called for him and received no answer. I wondered whether I had dreamed the whole thing. Perhaps I was still asleep in bed, and the trip through the hallway had been part of a dream. That explanation was comforting for a moment, but I felt awake. I remembered the cold floor. I remembered opening the door. I remembered standing in the living room and seeing the television off. The sequence felt too clear and ordinary to be a dream. There were no strange changes or impossible places. Everything in the house looked exactly as it should. The only impossible part was the disappearance of the sound and light. It is also possible I experienced a waking dream. Sometimes people wake from sleep while part of the brain is still dreaming. They may hear voices, see lights, or believe something is happening in the room. Maybe I heard a television program that was not really playing. Maybe I imagined my father laughing. Maybe the light in the hallway came from somewhere else. But all three things seemed connected. The laughter, the voices, and the glow all came from the direction of the living room. My mind would have had to create an entire normal scene without showing me anything obviously dreamlike. At that age, I did not know about sleep hallucinations. I only knew that I had heard my father watching television and then found an empty room. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. I do not remember whether I eventually checked where my parents were sleeping. I may have been too scared to leave the room again. What I clearly remember is turning on the television in my bedroom, or possibly another television I could safely watch without returning to the living room. I kept the volume low and watched Nick at Night. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air came on. Later, I watched George Lopez. Those shows were familiar and funny, and they helped make the room feel normal again. The voices from the television gave me something to focus on. I did not care what episodes were playing. I only wanted noise and light. Every time the screen became dark between scenes or advertisements, I became nervous. I kept looking toward my bedroom door. I wondered whether I would hear my father laughing again. I wondered whether the Star Wars show would begin playing from the living room even though no one was there. Nothing else happened. Eventually, morning came. Sunlight entered the house, and the fear became easier to manage. The hallway looked ordinary again. The living room was just the living room. The television sat where it always had. My parents were fine. I do not remember telling them about the experience the next morning. Maybe I did, and they dismissed it as a dream. Maybe I kept it to myself because I thought I would get into trouble for leaving my bedroom. It is also possible that I forgot about it quickly. Children experience strange things and then move on. School, games, meals, and daily life take over. The memory became buried somewhere in my mind. For years, I rarely thought about it. Then recently, the whole scene came back to me. I suddenly remembered the hallway layout. I remembered the television light shining around the corner. I remembered hearing Obi-Wan and Anakin. I remembered my father laughing. I remembered stepping forward just as the light disappeared. The details returned so clearly that I was surprised I had forgotten the event at all. Now I want to ask my father about that night. I want to know whether he remembers watching Star Wars late at night while I was young. Maybe he was in the living room and simply moved before I reached it. Perhaps there was another explanation I never considered. He might remember falling asleep on the sofa, waking suddenly, and going to bed. He might say the television sometimes switched itself off. Maybe the sound came from another room. There could be a completely normal answer. I hope there is. Still, several details continued to bother me. I knew my father's laugh. Children recognize the voices of their parents immediately. The laugh sounded close and natural, not distant or distorted. I also knew the voices from the Star Wars show. I did not hear random talking and later decide it must have been Obi-Wan and Anakin. I remember recognizing them while I was still in bed. The television light was visible on the hallway walls. It flickered in time with the sound. Then all of it stopped at once. If I dreamed the experience, it was unusually realistic. If I was awake, I do not know what created the sounds. Another possibility is that the television had been set to turn off automatically. Some televisions have sleep timers. My father may have been watching the show, fallen asleep, and then gone to bed earlier without me realizing. The television could have switched off at the exact moment I entered the hallway. But that does not explain the laughter. If my father had already gone to bed, why did I hear him? Maybe the laugh was part of the television program. Perhaps a character laughed, and my sleepy mind mistook it for my father. That is possible. The voices and the laughter may all have come from the show. Then the sleep timer turned off the television as I approached. My father might never have been in the room at all. That would explain the empty living room. It would also explain why nobody answered when I called. But even if that is what happened, the timing was disturbing. I woke, heard what sounded like my father, and walked toward the television. Just before I reached the corner, the screen shut off. I entered an empty room. For a child, that was enough to turn an ordinary house into something frightening. I've also wondered whether I was sleepwalking. Maybe I dreamed that the television was on while moving through the house. Perhaps I was not fully awake until I reached the living room. The sudden darkness may have been the moment my mind became conscious. That would explain why the early part of the experience felt vivid, but strange. Still, I remember making decisions. I decided to leave my bed because I wanted to spend time with my father. I recognized the program. I watched the light. I hesitated when it disappeared. Those thoughts felt deliberate. I do not know whether sleepwalking can include that kind of clear reasoning, but the brain can do complicated things while partly asleep. The truth is that there are many possible explanations, and none can be proven now. Too much time has passed. I do not know the exact date. I do not know whether my parents remember anything. I do not know whether the television had a timer or electrical problem. I only have the memory as it exists now. It may not be perfectly accurate. Childhood memories change over time. Details can become sharper, weaker, or mixed with other nights. Maybe the Star Wars dialogue came from a different memory. Maybe Fresh Prince and George Lopez were shows I watched on another sleepless night. But the central moment has always felt complete. I woke to my father laughing. I heard the television. I saw its glow. Then I walked toward it, and everything stopped. The empty living room is what stayed with me most. If the television had still been on, I would have assumed my father had gone to the kitchen. If the sound had continued without the screen, I might have searched for another source. Instead, the room offered nothing. No person. No sound. No light. It felt as though something had been pretending to be my father in the television, then stopped the moment I became close enough to see it. I do not seriously claim that is what happened. It is only the thought that frightened me as a child. Something had encouraged me to leave the safety of my bedroom. It used familiar sounds. My father's laughter, a show I recognized, the warm flicker of a television. Everything about it felt safe until I stepped into the hallway. Then, the light disappeared. Even now, that sequence unsettles me. Frightening things do not always appear as monsters or shadows. Sometimes they sound like someone you trust. Sometimes they use the ordinary noises of home. Sometimes they wait just beyond a corner where you cannot see them. I plan to speak to my father about it. Maybe he will remember the night and give me a simple answer. Perhaps he will laugh and tell me he used to watch that Star Wars show after putting me to bed. Maybe he turned off the television when he heard me coming and slipped into another room to avoid encouraging me to stay awake. If he says that, I will gladly accept it. It would explain most of the experience. But I still do not know how he could have left the living room without me seeing or hearing him. And I do not know why. The instant the television went dark, I felt certain that he was no longer there. Whatever happened, I was frightened enough to run back to my room and stay awake until morning. I spent the rest of the night watching Fresh Prince and George Lopez because I was too scared to sleep. The comedies kept the darkness away. They gave me voices I could trust because I could see exactly where they were coming from. More than anything, they stopped me from listening for another laugh from the empty living room. When I was 12 years old, my family moved into a house surrounded by a small area of woods. It was not completely isolated, but the trees made the property feel separated from everything around it. During the day, the place looked peaceful. At night, especially when the wind moved through the branches, it felt much more remote. Not long after we moved in, people began making comments about the house. Someone told us that a man had taken his own life there. The remarks were usually casual. Nobody sat us down and gave us a full history of the property. We would only hear a sentence here or there, often from people who seemed to enjoy watching our reactions. Because of that, we did not take the story seriously. We assumed people were trying to frighten the new family. Old houses always seem to collect rumors. If a door moves, someone says a ghost opened it. If the pipes make noise, people claim someone died in the room. We believed this was probably the same kind of thing. At least that was what we told ourselves. For the most part, the house felt normal. We unpacked our belongings, arranged the rooms, and settled into daily life. After a while, the unfamiliar rooms became home. Then small things started happening. The first incidents were easy to dismiss. Sometimes dishes would rattle in the drying rack by themselves. The sound was not always loud. It could be a soft clinking, like someone had lightly touched the edge of a plate or moved a cup. You would hear it from another room, walk into the kitchen, and find everything sitting exactly where it should be. We blamed the house. Maybe the floor shook slightly when someone walked nearby. Maybe a large vehicle passed outside. Maybe the washing machine, pipes, or heating system caused small vibrations. Any one of those explanations could have been true. Still, the dishes seemed to move when nobody was close enough to disturb them. Then we began hearing footsteps on the staircase. The stairs had a recognizable sound. Each step creaked differently, and you could usually tell when someone was going up or coming down. The footsteps did not sound like the house settling. They sounded like a person. You would hear the weight move from one stair to the next. Step. Pause. Step. Sometimes the sound traveled upward. Other times, it seemed to come down. We would assume a family member was using the stairs, but when we checked, nobody was there. At first, everyone accused everyone else. Someone must have been walking around. One of my brothers must have gone upstairs. Maybe someone had stepped onto the first stair and then turned away. But after it happened enough times, it became harder to blame one another. The sound was too clear. Something seemed to be moving on those stairs. No one wanted to say it directly, but the rumor about the man who had died in the house started feeling less like a joke. I still tried not to think about it. At 12 years old, I did not want to believe that something invisible might be walking through our home. It was easier to focus on normal explanations. Old wood moves. Pipes knock. Animals crawl through walls. Sound travels in strange ways. The woods surrounding the property were also full of life. Branches struck the outside of the house. Small animals moved near the foundation. Wind passed through gaps and created noises that could easily sound like voices or footsteps. I repeated those explanations whenever something happened. Then I experienced something that was more difficult to ignore. I was home alone when I heard the front door open. The door was made of steel, so it had a heavy and very specific sound. It did not move quietly. When someone opened it, you heard the handle turn, the metal shift, and the door move against the frame. When it closed, it made a solid sound that traveled through the house. That day, I heard it open and close. I immediately assumed someone had come home. I expected to hear a voice or see one of my family members walk into the room. Nobody called out. I waited for a few seconds. Then I heard footsteps. They were moving toward the staircase. I got up to see who had entered. The area near the front door was empty. No one was taking off a coat. No one was setting down bags. The door was closed. I checked outside, but I could not see anyone walking away. Then I heard the footsteps continue upstairs. The sound moved from one stair to the next, as if the person who had entered wanted to go directly to the upper floor without speaking. I called out. There was no answer. I followed far enough to look up the staircase. Nobody was there. The upper hallway was empty. I stood near the bottom, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I searched the house, but I did not find anyone. The doors and windows appeared secure. There was no sign that a stranger had entered. I told myself I must have heard two unrelated sounds. Maybe something struck the front door from outside. Maybe the wind moved it inside the frame. Then the normal creaks of the staircase started at the same time. It was possible. It did not feel convincing, but it was possible. After that, I became more aware of the house. I listened whenever the dishes rattled. I paid attention to the staircase. If a door moved, I checked it. Nothing ever appeared. There were only sounds. That changed one night when I left my bedroom to use the bathroom. The hallway was dark. I knew the layout well enough that I did not need to turn on the lights. The bathroom was not far away, and I had walked there at night many times. Most people understand how a familiar dark room can still feel navigable. You cannot see every object clearly, but your mind seems to know where things are. You can sense the shape of the doorway. You know where the wall begins. You know how much empty space is in front of you. That night, as I approached the bathroom, I felt that someone was standing outside the door. I do not mean that I heard breathing or saw a shadow. I felt the shape of a person in the darkness. It was as if my mind could measure the space he occupied. The figure seemed tall. I could sense the height of his head, the width of his shoulders, and the distance between his body and the wall behind him. The feeling was so clear that I did not immediately become frightened. I assumed it was one of my older brother's friends. My brothers sometimes had people over, and a tall young man standing in the hallway would not have been impossible. I thought someone had left a bedroom and was waiting to use the bathroom. I reached around the figure and felt for the light switch. That is how certain I was that someone stood there. I expected my arm to brush against him. I expected him to move aside or say something. My hand found the switch. I turned on the light. The hallway was empty. There was no one outside the bathroom. No one stood near the wall. There was not even an object that could have created the shape of a person. The space was completely open. I froze with my hand still near the switch. Only a second earlier, I had been certain a tall man stood in front of me. I had sensed his body so clearly that I tried to reach around him. Now there was nothing. I looked toward the nearby bedrooms. The doors were either closed or still. Nobody had moved away. There had not been enough time for a person to disappear. I checked the bathroom. Empty. I looked behind me. The hallway was empty in both directions. A cold feeling moved through me. I did not stay there long. I used the bathroom quickly and returned to my room, leaving more lights on than I normally would. Later, I tried to explain it. Maybe my eyes had created a shape from the darkness. Even when we think we cannot see anything, the brain uses weak shadows and small differences in light to build an image. Perhaps the doorway, wall, and objects nearby formed something that looked like a person. The human brain is trained to recognize faces and bodies. It can turn coats, furniture, and darkness into figures. But I had not only seen a shape, I had felt the depth of it. I knew where the person seemed to begin and end. It felt as though I was sharing the hallway with someone. The memory stayed with me, but eventually, daily life continued. Years passed in that house. The dishes still rattled sometimes. Footsteps still crossed the stairs. We learned to live with noises that had no clear source. By the time I was around 17, I had become used to the place. The incidents were strange, but nothing had physically harmed me. I could usually ignore them. Then came the experience that frightened me more than everything else combined. It happened at around 4 in the morning. I was awake in my bedroom, sitting at my computer and browsing the internet. I had stayed up much later than I should have. The rest of the house was quiet, and everyone else seemed to be asleep. The only real light in the room came from the computer screen. I was sitting in a desk chair with my back facing part of the room. At that hour, the house had a different atmosphere. Even familiar sounds seemed louder. The walls felt still, and every small movement stood out. I was focused on the screen when I suddenly felt a cold breeze move across my left shoulder. It was not a general drop in temperature. It felt like a narrow stream of cold air passing directly over me. I immediately thought one of the windows must be open. It was winter, or at least cold enough that a draft would have been noticeable. I turned and checked. The windows were closed. I looked at the frame and made sure there was no visible gap. Nothing seemed wrong. I returned my attention to the computer. Then the cold spot moved. It passed behind me and reached my right shoulder. The sensation did not feel like normal airflow spreading through the room. It felt controlled, as though something cold had moved from one side of my body to the other. I sat still. The hairs on my arms rose. I tried to tell myself that the room had an ordinary draft. Cold air can travel in strange ways, especially in an older house. It might have come through the wall, under the door, or from a vent. Before I could fully calm myself, I felt pressure on both shoulders. It came down suddenly. The best way I can describe it is that someone seemed to be standing behind my chair with both hands pressing downward. The force was sharp and strong. My shoulders were pushed toward the seat. At first, I thought someone had entered the room without me hearing them. I tried to turn around. I could not. The pressure increased. I attempted to stand. My body would not rise from the chair. I pushed my feet against the floor and tried to lift myself with all the strength I had. Nothing happened. It felt as though someone much stronger than me was holding me down. Panic hit immediately. This was not a sound in another room. It was not a shadow in a hallway. Something was touching me. I could feel the force against my shoulders. I tried again to stand. I leaned forward, pushed against the floor, and pulled at the desk. The chair moved slightly, but my upper body remained forced downward. I could not see anyone behind me. The computer screen was still glowing in front of me. The room looked normal, but the pressure was real. I started shaking my shoulders violently. I twisted left and right, trying to break free from whatever was holding me. The force seemed to adjust with my movement. Whenever I tried to rise, it pushed down. I felt completely helpless. I remember thinking that if there was a person behind me, I could not defend myself because I could not turn around. If it was not a person, I had no idea what to do. I may have tried to shout, but I do not remember whether any sound came out. My entire focus was on standing. The experience probably lasted only about a minute. At the time, it felt much longer. Every second became a struggle. I kept moving my shoulders in wild directions. I pushed with my legs. I tried to throw my weight forward and then back. Eventually, the pressure weakened. I forced myself upward. The moment I became free, I stood and turned around. There was nobody behind me. The room was empty. I did not stop to search. I did not check under the bed or look inside the closet. I ran. I left the room, went through the house, and ran outside. The cold night air hit me, but I did not care. I only wanted to get away from the chair and whatever had held me there. Outside, I could breathe again. My heart was racing, and my shoulders still felt as though someone had been pressing on them. I stayed away from the room until I felt safe enough to return. I do not know how long that took. When I finally went back inside, nothing had changed. The chair remained near the desk. The computer was still on. The windows were closed. There was no sign that anyone had entered my bedroom. I checked the house. The doors were secure. My family was asleep. Nobody admitted coming into my room. There was no reason for anyone to sneak behind me, hold me down, and then disappear without making a sound. I have considered whether it might have been sleep paralysis. The experience had some similarities. Sleep paralysis can make a person feel pressure on the body. People often describe being held down, touched, or unable to move. Some sense a presence behind them. But I was not asleep in bed. I was sitting upright at my computer, actively browsing the internet. I had moved to check the windows only moments earlier. I was awake enough to inspect the room, return to the desk, and feel the cold spot cross from one shoulder to the other, unless I briefly fell asleep without realizing it. The experience did not fit normal sleep paralysis. I also considered a muscle problem. Maybe my shoulders cramped. Perhaps my back locked and prevented me from standing. A sudden nerve issue could create pressure, weakness, or loss of movement. But it felt external. The force was not simply pain or stiffness. It felt like two hands pressing down. When I shook my shoulders, the pressure seemed to resist me. Then it released. I did not have lasting pain afterward. There were no marks. I never experienced the same physical problem again. Anxiety can also cause strange sensations. At 4 a.m, after years of hearing stories and noises in the house, maybe a cold draft frightened me enough that I panicked. My muscles could have tensed, making it difficult to stand. The brain can turn fear into physical symptoms. That is possible. But the pressure came before the panic. I became frightened because I was being held down. I was not already imagining something behind me. For years, I have tried to connect that experience to the rumors about the man who died in the house. Maybe there really had been a suicide there. Maybe whoever died never left. But I never confirmed the full story. I do not know the man's name. I do not know where in the house he died. I do not know whether the rumor was true or something people invented to frighten us. It would be easy to say his ghost caused everything. The dishes, the footsteps, the steel door, the tall figure outside the bathroom, the hands pressing on my shoulders. But I cannot prove any of that. Each event could have a separate, ordinary explanation. The dishes may have rattled because of vibrations. The stairs may have creaked as the house changed temperature. The front door noise could have come from the wind. The footsteps might have traveled from another part of the house. The figure in the dark could have been my mind creating a human shape. The pressure at the desk could have been a physical or neurological reaction. When listed separately, none of those explanations is impossible. But together, they made the house feel occupied by something we could not see. The worst part was how the experiences became more personal. At first, the strange activity remained at a distance. We heard dishes. We heard footsteps. Then I heard the door and followed movement upstairs. Later, I sensed a man standing directly in front of me. Finally, something seemed to touch me and keep me trapped in a chair. It felt as though the presence had moved closer over time. I do not know whether that was truly happening or whether my fear made the later experiences feel connected to the earlier ones. Memory naturally creates patterns. Once you believe a house may be haunted, every sound becomes evidence. You stop hearing old pipes and begin hearing footsteps. You stop seeing darkness and begin seeing a man. I understand that. Still, I cannot dismiss what happened at the computer. I know how hard I tried to stand. I remember pushing with every ounce of strength I had. I remember the helplessness of being held in place. I remember twisting my shoulders and feeling the pressure remain. Then, suddenly, I could move. Nothing stood behind me. Nothing ran from the room. There was no person to explain the hands I had felt. We eventually moved away from that house. I was relieved, although I do not remember admitting it at the time. In the new place, I did not hear the same footsteps. The dishes did not rattle for no reason. I did not feel tall figures standing in dark hallways. Nothing pressed me into a chair. That does not prove the old house was haunted. A different building makes different sounds. A new environment changes the way a person sleeps and reacts. But I felt safer after leaving. I still think about the house sometimes. I picture the staircase and hear someone moving from one step to the next. I remember the steel front door opening and closing while I was alone. I remember reaching around the shape of a tall man to turn on the bathroom light. Most clearly, I remember sitting in front of the computer at 4 in the morning. A cold breeze crossed my left shoulder. It moved behind me to my right. Then 2 invisible hands seemed to press down and hold me in the chair. I fought until I could stand. When I turned around, the room was empty. I ran outside because I had no other idea what to do. Maybe every incident in that house had a normal explanation. Maybe the story about the suicide made us notice things we would otherwise have ignored. Maybe fear filled the empty spaces. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And even after all these years, I have never found an explanation for whatever stood behind me and refused to let me leave that chair.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.